I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. We are honored today to have as our guest Jack Etheridge, a former Georgia legislator and a retired Superior Court judge in Fulton County. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you, Bob.
You are what is becoming a rarity in these parts, and that's a native Atlantan.
Right. And proud of it.
You grew up here?
Yes, sir.
Well, tell us about your youth.
Well, I had the good fortune of being born here. As a matter of fact, on Peachtree Road, right within 2 blocks of Lenox Square was my home. It still stands. And went to school at R.L. Hope Grammar School on Piedmont Road, and then North Fulton for a short time, and to Darlington School in Rome, Georgia. From there I went to Davidson College and had some military service in between that. And then to Emory Law School. I've always been very proud of the fact that my father, who was born and raised around Auburn, Georgia, in that part of the state, came to Atlanta as a young man, practiced law, and then became what I consider to be a wonderful trial judge himself. He died when I was 18 and 19, and I've missed him sorely ever since then, of a cancer. And but he left a wonderful gift to me, a heritage about which I've been very proud all my life.
How did you get interested in politics?
Well, I suspect it's because of him. He loved people, and he liked things that happened, and he liked to tell stories and so forth. He's also very smart in an academic sense as well. So once or twice he must have had a political race. I don't remember precisely, but I remember going with him wherever he would go, and he would make speeches, and I'd hear those. In those days, politics was more congenial, let me say. There was no television, and there was not much radio. And when you spoke to a group standing on a podium speaking to them. I remember Herman Talmadge, of course, in the early days, listened to him. I've even heard Gene Talmadge before his death. And so I was fascinated with that and the dynamics of politics, because it is an inexact science. It's not something that can be described literally in a textbook way. And therefore it calls on the skills of persuasion and thought, and I think empathy toward those with whom you're speaking. You've got to understand they have a point of view too. And that always intrigued me.
So you ran for the State House of Representatives.
Yes.
Tell us about your first race.
Well, the first race that I had was, I would think, because the time was ripe for me, I thought. I had been practicing law for a few years and continued to practice law while I was in politics, of course. But I wanted to get more into the arena, and I was loving the practice of law. But about this time, we had an interesting change in our town. The mayor was Bill Hartsfield, who was I look back now, was a dear friend of mine, sort of a mentor in a sense. And I would occasionally go around town and make speeches for him and others who were running for political office, like Hoke Smith, Jr. And I loved that. That was fun. And Mr. Hartsfield came to the time of retirement, and he said to me, "You need to get in political life." And I was young. And about that time, the new mayor was Ivan Allen. And I had the great good fortune of knowing Ivan Allen. He'd referred some business to our firm, and I'd worked for some of his people that he'd referred to us, and so I had a good relationship with him. He had been having some difficulty with Muggsy Smith, who was then in the legislature. I don't remember, nor is it important what those were, but Ivan wanted someone in the legislature whom he had a connection with, and so he came to me and he said, "How about you running?" And you know, that's very flattering to a young man. Didn't have any money, but I had a lot of interest. And so I said, but how can I afford it? In those days, politics was not very expensive. When you look back, there was no expense of television and those things, but still it took money to put out your written material and the mailings and all. He said, well, I'll help you, because I'll tell you everybody that's given money to Muggsy Smith that I know about in the last few years. Well, that struck me as being an interesting proposition. And I said, well, that's fine. I liked Mr. Smith and admired him, though I did think at the time he was getting off my track politically. He was more conservative, though he's a courageous man and did the right thing as he saw it, and is a good man. So I said, okay, that's a deal. And then I put together some friends of mine, and we went to every single person who had given Muggsy money that we could identify, and said to him, it's time for a change. And so most of them came to our side. They felt it was time for Muggsy to step aside. Didn't amount to a lot of money, but it was enough to finance my campaign, as they say, and for which I was very grateful. In those days, the legislature did not pay much on a per diem basis. It was not something you'd do to go in and make a living at, but it was very challenging, and that's the reason I entered the race, and happily won a right substantial victory.
So you go to the State House. What were your goals?
Well, my goal, I think if I could articulate a single goal, I'm not sure I can, but my goal was to see that Atlanta got at least a reasonable recognition in state affairs. In those days, Atlanta was virtually a non-entity in the state legislature. And it always struck me as being terribly unfair that we had no county unit votes that were relative to other counties. We had 3. Eccles County had 1,600 people and they had 1. So it was just a terrible disparity. I wanted to see that Atlanta got its fair share. I wanted to meet a lot of fascinating people throughout the state that I knew I could meet as a member of the legislature. And I wanted to see if I could do it. It was a 2-year term, and I knew that practicing law was my first desire and objective, would be a good lawyer. And I wasn't sure you could do that in the legislature and in an urban law practice. I think you can, or you could then. And so I knew I could get out in 2 years if I didn't want to continue, or could run for re-election, hopefully get re-elected.
Reapportionment changed that.
Yes.
You went from 3 members of the House of Representatives to, what, 24 was it?
Yeah, we had 24. The reapportionment during this time, when Ivan Allen became the mayor, we were in great tumult in this state in many ways. Not the least was the reapportionment question, because it was perfectly obvious that it was unconstitutional. It was not right. But the powers that be didn't want it changed. The powers that be never want the status quo changed. And so looming above us was the certainty of constitutional review. And it was coming. And everybody knew it was coming. And so people were having to re-examine the whole attitude about it. One of the things that I also thought I might like to have a part of was a review of a very unpopular subject, which was the diminution of the number of counties in Georgia. We had and still have 159 counties in this state. I don't recall the data, but probably 100 of them were insolvent or wholly dependent on urban Georgia. I mean, we are, and still today, are finding that the urban Georgia is paying for the maintenance of most of the counties in Georgia. That's not right. And so I had I think, audacity, if not the foolishness, of introducing a resolution to study the question of the consolidation of counties in Georgia. And that doesn't reflect any intelligence on my part, because the minute I did that, I was in trouble. I remember I went to Mr. Steve Mitchell, who was Margaret Mitchell's brother and a lawyer and a wonderful fellow, wise old man. And I said, Steve, I've stepped into a hornet's nest. I didn't realize how controversial it would be just to have a study made of what appears to me a clearly economic benefit for the state of Georgia at large. Of course, we all remember that we have 159 counties, in large part because we wanted a county seat within reach of a horse and buggy. That was the theme. So the county courthouse would be, somebody could get to it, almost could walk to it, or county come by mule or wagon. No longer, of course, applies. And that's why we had this proliferation of counties. We were a big state. And I said, Steve, tell me something that would help me get this thing on some rational basis, some practical basis. And he said this, I'll never forget him, bless his heart. He said, well, what I want you to do is introduce a bill that will provide for the lifetime pension of every existing county commissioner, city clerk, county clerk in that county. And then see if we can get a referendum and get it passed. He said, I bet you can do it. Well, of course, that was in a way ridiculous, but it's sadly ridiculous, because the fact is the only reason for this maintenance in most counties was to support the infrastructure of government in those counties.
Getting back to 1962, the year you first ran, there was a historic governor's race between the old and the new. And of course, Senator Carl Sanders won that race. That's looked upon as being a real turning point in Georgia. Would you agree?
Oh yes, I don't think there's any doubt about it. Governor Sanders was not the model of, as I think back, that one we were accustomed to in Georgia. Of course, we were accustomed to Marvin Griffin and accustomed to Herman Talmadge, and those were the good old-fashioned down and dirty political days when you went to eat the next guy's barbecue, don't you know, and you voted for the other fella. And it was not a serious exercise of economics and government. It was not. It was largely driven by dreams of the past, hopes for the future to maintain the status quo, an unawareness of the impact of urban living on people and of transportation. So big issues existed, for example, like paved roads, farm to markets, things like that, and so forth. So it involved all kinds of considerations, as for example, the highway department. Who's going to run it? Who's going to get the money derived from taxes? Should it go straight to the highway department, or should it go into the general fund and things of that sort? I mean, it just had tremendous implications, none of which had really been faced in prior governorships, except perhaps Ellis Arnold, who did think out of the box, outside the box, and was concerned with the transportation into this state from across the country. Until Ellis Arnold came along, we were terribly punished in the South by tax revenue rules, and he fought that and did a lot of good. But except for Ellis Arnold, I don't think we'd had much of a, it was mostly parochial. Carl Sanders brought to the state, as I remember it, a different perspective in that regard. And that was a very defining moment in our government, I think.
Let's talk about that reapportionment. As I said, or we said, you went from 3 to 24. That was the first time that the Georgia House of Representatives was integrated.
That's right, and that was a time of tremendous anticipation. Nobody quite knew what to expect. Would there be a standoff vis-a-vis black and white? Would there be we didn't speak of it then so much, but conservative vis-a-vis liberal? We didn't use those words much then. Rural, urban. So there was a quiet but a very strong concern about how we, the legislature, and maybe in a larger sense the state, would deal with this. Because this is new. This was very new. If you talked about integration of the House, you were talking about the last memory of that would have been post-Civil War. Occupation by the feds. You know, we were occupied over 10 years by the federal government. And all of those recollections were, in a way, vaguely sometimes, but emanating in the minds and hearts of members of the legislature. They didn't know what their people would think about it. I mean, should they go to lunch with a black legislator? Should they have a drink? Should they consort with him in any public way? I'll have to tell you that, for example, because I was chairman of the delegation when it became integrated, I felt strongly that I had the job of introducing members of our legislature to urban life to the extent I could. And I took, at that time, the Speaker of the House with me to meet a captain on the Atlanta police force. And we went down into a black neighborhood. I had an appointment with the captain, and he was a black man. He was the first black captain of the police department we had. Excuse me. And that was the first time the Speaker of the House had ever shaken hands with a black man. I was just flabbergasted. He'd come from long into southwest Georgia, wasn't accustomed to that. And here we were, the three of us, standing on the corner with him dealing with the captain of a police department in Atlanta who had authority, who had dignity, and had power. And that's where we were when we integrated the House at that time. Now, fortunately, this speaker, like so many others, was a fair-minded man. This was just a new experience. He learned from it, and he found out that he could communicate where he never had the experience before, at a level that he had never really anticipated.
Who were some of the first black members of the Georgia House of Representatives?
Well, I've mentioned Grace Hamilton, who I always remember so fondly as being the ideal, the quintessential legislator of Tris. The principal one, though not the most important in some ways, was Julian Bond. Julian Bond had run in a very good election in the city of Atlanta in his district, and he'd won. He was a winner. He was a very articulate young man, handsome, and he came along at the time when the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Martin Luther King Jr. and others were becoming increasingly outspoken. And if I could just tell this story about Julian Bond's situation as he came to the legislature, he was asked by WGST, the radio station here, one day, what he thought about some black men who had burned their draft card. As you remember, Vietnam was going on, and the draft card was something everyone had to carry. And Julian, who I suspect was pretty naive, but he was trying to be as honest as he could be, he said, well, I have not, this is almost an exact quote, I have not burned mine, but I would not object to those on moral grounds who would burn their own. That's kind of his statement. You might have a better memory of that than I do, but that's pretty close to what he said. He didn't burn his own, but he wouldn't have an objection. Well, within an hour, that was across the state. That was like a flamethrower that had been sent out across the state. Bond is unpatriotic. Bond is opposed to war. He was following, of course, what Martin Luther King was saying and what many people were saying, that it was an act of moral courage to burn the card and so forth. And so he immediately became the target all over Georgia of hatred. I mean, it was terrible. It was really one of the first times I'd encountered that in my life. I'd been fairly young. I was fairly young, and I was had been protected and so forth, but I saw it. I mean, irredeemably lost was Julian Bond in the minds of people who had never seen him, didn't know him, but they heard this. And so the legislators picked up on that. This was a week or two before we were sworn in. This was probably in early January of '63 or '4. And the first day of any legislative session, all of the members have to stand and take the oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States and of this state and so forth. One member of the House, whom I don't remember, whom I don't know, offered a resolution requiring that Julian Bond not be sworn that day, not be allowed to take the oath. Well, that presented an enormous challenge for all of us. I'm the chairman of the delegation. I felt strongly that that was wrong. The man had been elected. The resolution would prohibit him from taking the office to which he was elected. And we didn't know what kind of violence might arise from that, because now there were groups that were beginning to get together and decide this was just not going to happen. Well, fortunately, it didn't happen. I met Julian downstairs at the courthouse steps. We had the Capitol steps, and we walked up together in the elevator. We went up together in the elevator as a little coterie to surround him. We didn't know what might happen. He walks in, and I had arranged that as chairman of the delegation that we were going to sit together, so that I sat on Julian's right in the House, and he sat next to me, and on my left was Charlie Brown, who was our oldest member of the legislature then, distinguished old-timer. So there were the two of us on either side. And everyone was asked to stand and take the oath, but Mr. Bond, Julian Bond, you are to remain seated. Tremendous moment. I mean, it was a tremendous. I didn't know personally what to do. I felt I had to take the oath. I was elected by my people to do it, but somehow there's an onus to that I didn't like, but I did. And Julian remained seated, and so everyone but him took the oath of office. I'll never forget that moment. I saw good people on the House on the floor take that oath. And it was not an oath against Julian, it was an oath to take office to which they were elected, but still it was some kind of a support of a resolution that was like throwing a skunk on the table. You know, you could never get rid of it, you know. And the day went on. But of course the theme of that day was patriotism. Julian was un-American, unpatriotic. And everybody in the House, this is a footnote that's very personal to me, and so it might be boring, and forgive me for that. Everybody in the House was given a flag, a lapel to put on their suit, as is common today. And this is a personal experience I had. Traditionally, after the swearing in, the committee chairmen all went to the Capital City Club for luncheon. Every committee chairman. And I was fortunate to be chairman of the Special Judiciary Committee that year. And I was damned if I was going to put that flag on my coat lapel. I just felt like I couldn't do it. And I tell this story because it was one of the first times in my life that I'd ever felt completely isolated. I was the only person in that room, long table, who didn't have flag on his lapel. And some of those there who were my friends, I mean friends, we had been in the legislature together, did not speak to me, would not look at me because of the failure to wear that pin. Now that's very personal, and I don't have any grievance, I hold no grievance to anybody for it, but it taught me something about being ignored or being a nobody that I don't think I'd ever had in my life before. And it taught me something about the black person who achieves something and then is not acknowledged in any respect, which was a great event that day. So that was a big moment, and Julian later on, within a matter of weeks, the federal district court heard the case, reversed the legislature, said it was unconstitutional as it should have. It was reaffirmed in the appellate courts, and took his seat and became a productive member of the House.
What is some of the legislation you worked on there while you were in the House?
Well, I started, I think, with the local ones. As I mentioned, maybe earlier, I don't know that it did. One was fluoridation. The medical profession, the dental profession in particular, had come to me to ask me to introduce a bill to provide fluoridation in the water. I thought that was a good idea. I didn't know anything about fluoridation, but I studied it. And I introduced the bill, and all hell broke loose. I'll never forget it. It was considered a communist plot. In those days, that was a big deal. John Birch Society was strong in those days. They sort of, in my view, took positions on things that had nothing to do with the merits. But many very conservative people thought that was a communist plot. They even said there was an office in Chicago which was sending down instructions to me and others because, of course, this would be a way to fluoridate the water and thus kill everybody in the community. That was the ultimate result. And, of course, again, that was introduced as a local bill of general application. So we could deal with it in local committees, not general. It was a different way of handling litigation. And it passed ultimately, and has demonstrated, and the Cobb County I never will forget, the Cobb County Junior Chamber of Commerce, I believe it was, issued a resolution condemning me and others who would support such a bill. That was one. It passed, and of course fluoridation has been a boon to kids all over the world, all over this country. It taught me a lot about how strong people can be when they oppose you. They're not very kind, you know. I think another one that has to do with the change of the world when I was there was something that one easily can forget, but it had to do with the elimination of the office of coroner in Fulton County. And that was significant because one of the great common law positions grew out of old England, which is highly regarded now, which I love common law. I loved common law, was the office of coroner. And the coroner had a good many different official positions and powers, but ultimately it came down in modern days, not the days of the legislature that I was in, came down to being an elected position in the county where there were no qualifications required. We had in Georgia for many years a blind man who was a coroner, and he was a good man. And you ran as coroner really a old-fashioned politics and so forth. And we had an elected official here. The bill I introduced, which was then passed, was highly controversial again because it was to change the status quo. And it required, in the terms of the legislation, I don't know that I have it here, it required that that there be no longer a coroner, but there be a medical examiner, and he had to have medical, had to be an MD. That was an interesting learning experience for me because every time you introduce a bill that's new, you create a lot of controversy. I had a bill that probably my most important learning experience that first session was one where I felt that school bus drivers in Georgia ought to have training, ought to have something more than just the ordinary ordinary driver's license. And so I introduced a bill which I thought would fly through the legislature. I found out that it was the word. It never got out of committee because school bus drivers were sons and daughters and nephews and retarded cousins of people in politics, and that was a good job, and they couldn't have qualified. And I just never had thought about that. That's changed, I hope, now, and school bus drivers have to have certain qualifications, but in those days they had to have none, except the ordinary driver's license. Those are the kind of bills I was doing the first session. And I'll never forget one, I'll finish with this one, where the bill was to prohibit the theft of copper wires along telephone lines. I didn't know anything about that, but the telephone company, I think, came to me and said, we got to make this a felony, because people were stealing copper wires all over Georgia, selling them and getting a misdemeanor. And so it was a perfectly good bill, nothing wrong with that bill. I introduced it. As the vote was coming up, I noticed that throughout the floor of the House was a whispering campaign. Something was going on. I didn't know whether it's about my bill or what else. And when it came up for a vote, it was disastrously defeated. I mean, I almost was the only one who voted for it. Well, I was distraught. I was almost crying. I was so embarrassed. And I walked up to the bathroom in the back of the hall there. Went in there, just sort of got to get myself together. And one of the old deans of the legislature, I don't know whether it was Fred Hand or who it was, but one of the wonderful old timers, been there 30 years, and who was a friend, I thought, came in to see me, and he put his arm around my shoulders, and he said, "Son," said, "you didn't do very well out there, did you?" I said, "No, sir, I'm embarrassed. I don't know whether I should even be in politics." And he said, "Well, let me tell you what you can do. You can go in the House and you can ask on a point of personal privilege for the Speaker of the House," and that was George T. Smith at that time, to allow you to recall that bill tomorrow. You get a chance to do it one time for reconsideration. I didn't know I could do that. I did that, and as I was speaking to that bill a minute, I noticed Mr. Hand, or whoever it was, kind of do this, you know. Bill came up, it was passed without objection. And I asked Mr. Hand afterwards, I said, "Look, Mr. Hand, what in the world happened? It wasn't my persuasive talk." "No," he said, "Son, just wanted you to learn where the power is." And I did, brother, I did. And it passed, and of course, that was good. So those are some things I did the first year.
Let's talk about some legislation that really affected the city of Atlanta and some of the urban areas of the state in that transitional period.
Yes, right.
For example, you were very active in the passage of the alcohol bill for Atlanta.
Yes. Very important bill for Atlanta's future. In Fulton County, as I think would be true all over Georgia at that time, you could not serve a mixed drink. You could only serve wine because the degree and the amount of alcohol was limited. And you could get by with 6 glasses of wine, but you couldn't have 1 martini, if you see what I mean. And all the hotels were struggling about that. But to compound that problem, we had a very active Solicitor General of the state criminal court, who every now and then would want to get a little publicity, and he would raid a hotel, and because they'd served a martini, and he'd get his name in the paper, and it would go away. But no hotel was willing to invest a huge amount of money taking the risk. So they went to Mr. Ivan Allen, and he knew this. Everybody knew that. He said, you know, Charlotte and Jacksonville and Birmingham are talking about convention hotels. You don't have one that was a new idea. The idea that a hotel could also be a convention center was not known really across the country. Now we take it for granted. And say, we ain't building a hotel in this city. Well, we're going to take that risk. So unless you can get something passed, we're going to Birmingham. We're going to, and we didn't take that for granted. These cities were threats to Atlanta's leadership in the Southeast. So I introduced the bill at Ivan Allen's behest, I think. I can't remember now the basis for it, but certainly it was a bill that was a general bill of local application, which meant that it would apply only to cities of 300,000, I believe, or more. Only Atlanta. And all hell broke loose. Dr. Turner, the preacher of the, what's the name of his church? You remember his church out there?
That Druid Hills Baptist.
Druid Hills Baptist Church. He took the lead to destroy that bill, even though it only applied to Fulton County. It was a threat, of course, throughout the state. He assigned a preacher to, I think, virtually every single member of the legislature. He took me on himself as the leader. He could have prayer meetings for me. I was the author of the bill, and I was trying to get it passed. Just a local bill. And it was huge. It became John Barleycorn bill of the state at that time. We got it into the local committees and got it out, and it went read twice in the House. It went to the Senate. It was read through the Senate, came back to the House. It was kicked around, delayed by everybody until the last day of the session that year, 63 or 4. And you have to read a bill 3 times to get it enacted into law. It has to be read in each house. And when it's read the 3rd time without objection, then the Speaker will sign the bill, and then it has to go to the clerk of the House, and she has to, that was Miss Hirsch. What's her first name?
Jeanette.
Jeanette, wonderful person. Miss Jeanette Hirsch would have to authenticate it, and then the governor had to sign it. So we're down to the last day of the legislature, which is the most important day of any legislature, because that's when extra things happen to bills. And I got the Speaker to promise, I don't want to overstate that, I'm sure others did too, but I was interested in that bill, that was my bill, to promise to call the bill up at 3 o'clock that afternoon. We usually would go till midnight that day. And he did, at some risk to himself, because he could have left it off the calendar. Then we had to deal with a single legislator who said and told me that he was devoting his career to killing this bill. And of course he knew if he did kill it, he could take credit for it in every Baptist church in Georgia, I expect. And that was his thing. Every morning he would check to see where the bill was. Bob Cohn was a reporter for the Augusta paper, and he was a good one. And I didn't want to make him complicit in this conspiracy, but I asked him if he would interview this man before Tom Watson's statue downtown. Tom Watson was from around Madison, Georgia, and I knew he couldn't resist it. That is, this legislator. And so he did that. Bob took him down, interviewed him before the statute, and at that very moment, this is now 3 o'clock, the bill was called on the House floor. It was read routinely. There were no objections. And the Speaker, oh yes, that man is Howard Tamplin. Exactly right. That's right. I remember the name. I couldn't forget him. Anyway, Mr. Tamplin and Bob Cohn were down there. Bob can tell this story too. I hope he will sometime. And when he came back up, prepared to object to the bill, when it ever came up, and he was going to sit there all day long, they told him, well, Mr. Tamplin, that bill's already been passed. And the moment it was signed by the speaker, I took it by hand to Ms. Hirsch in the clerk's office. She signed the authentication. She was prepared to do that. I took it down to the office of Carl Sanders. I might have handed it to you first, I'm not sure. But he was prepared for it. He signed the bill, and we had in the Knight's Journal, Atlanta Journal, we had the story that the bill had been passed. I suspect within no more than 3 to 6 months, we had a contract for the first convention hotel in Atlanta, and it was down around where the Marriott Hotel is now. A great triumph for Ivan Allen, because then and at that moment we could say to anybody who wanted to build a hotel in town that we've got a convention facility that can serve mixed drinks. And of course, in a sort of a way, that's sort of the beginning of our convention city, combined with the leadership we had from Ivan Allen and others, and the airport and so forth. But that was an ironic twist to what could have been a catastrophe for us.
The idea of MARTA was alive when you were.
Oh boy, was it! MARTA was an idea that had to come, but it was revolutionary. And the reason it was revolutionary is that to get MARTA done, you had to create an authority. And an authority had to encompass more than one county. And as far as I know, we had no authorities in Georgia. I might be wrong, but I think that was the first one. The authority had to include anywhere MARTA was going to be, and Jamie Mackey was strong in that. There were a group of people, good people, who worked hard on putting it together and getting the concept right. There was really no model across the country. I remember I was asked to kind of look into the model that we could find, and the New York Port Authority was about the best thing we could find at that time. San Francisco had not yet developed. Toronto was beginning to start metropolitan and rapid transit authorities. But Atlanta had to include 5 counties to work, we thought. You know, Cobb and Gwinnett and Fulton and DeKalb and Clayton. And nobody ever thought about that before. Well, we got through all those hurdles. We'd meet at night, night after night after night, trying to work out something. And it was opposed by the right wing, big deal. They thought, again, that was a consolidation of government. That was going. And then when it really hit the fan, was one night when somebody said, well, what are you going to do about policing MARTA? How are you going to do that? You going to have a city of Atlanta policeman get on the car and get off when it gets to DeKalb County, and DeKalb County policeman? You know, and what are you going to do about that? And I'll never forget that night, because it really wasn't something we'd had on the table to consider at the beginning. Just not something that was fundamental to the thought processes we were trying to use to get there. Somebody said, well, we got to create a police force. Wow. We heard from John Birch, we heard from everybody in the country that had to do with conservative issues. That this was, now you're talking about real communism now. Oh my, I almost didn't want to go to work the next day, because we had to create a MARTA police department, and of course that was necessary. But in those days, it wasn't just a little thing. This was important stuff in those days, and thank goodness MARTA was created. We lost 3 referendums after the bill was passed. And thanks to my former law partner, Huie, who took over that responsibility when I was out of the legislature then, but Stell was the principal spokesman in this community for the passage of the referendum.
Don't you think that that the failure of those 3 counties actually has hurt the system?
There's no question about it. Cobb County had no business voting it down. They thought, the John Birch Society and the others opposed it. They didn't vote to come in, as you know. They've profited mightily by the, I think, by the Atlanta community, building the main station and all the lines. You don't talk about much about fairness, but it's certainly not fair. And they have their own model transit system, which is a good one, I think, but it ought to have been integrated. But sometimes you do the best you can.